From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Mykel Taylor will talk about the current outlook on the commodity title of the new farm bill as the congressional conferees finalize it, and she'll look at land value and rental rate trends in Kansas. She'll be addressing all these topics at K-State's 2018 Agricultural Lenders Conferences next week. Then K-State's Jeanne Falk Jones will walk through the recommended steps for sampling harvested forages for nutrient content heading into the fall and winter. She'll talk about how to pull representative samples from bales for an accurate laboratory analysis. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham has advice on late harvesting of tomatoes and peppers. Plus more straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Thanks for being along with us. This is Agriculture Today. Right here on our first part of the broadcast, we're going to draw on information that will be passed along to the audiences at K-State's Agricultural Lenders Conferences. A pair of these coming up next week, one in Garden City, the other right here in Manhattan. And one of the speakers who will be talking on 2 topics is with us now, Mykel Taylor, agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. And Mykel, you've been enlisted to hit a couple of primary topics in agriculture during the Agricultural Lenders Conferences, one being the Farm Bill, the other being land values, and coupled with that, rental rates. And we want to touch upon all of that here today. Before we get into that, this Agricultural Lenders Conference series is a very important get-together for financiers out there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for them to get together and hear what's going on in the ag sector, get a sense of crop and livestock outlook, as you mentioned, land values, farm bill, and just some of the general topics that we're facing today in ag, and gives them the opportunity to network a little bit and visit with each other.
And these are popular meetings. In fact, the one in Garden City is already, to put it this way, sold out, but the one in Manhattan can still accommodate those who want to attend, and we'll get into how to pursue that in just a moment. The Farm Bill, the conference committee process is underway.
Correct. So we did not pass a farm bill by the end of September, and the world did not come to an end. But it does mean that some more work has to be done. The 4 principals that are working on this, they and their staff are still working on hammering out some differences and some compromises through the month of October. But we're not going to see anything back in committee or on the floor of the House or the Senate until after the midterm elections. If they don't get this passed before the new Congress is seated, then everything that they've done up until this point gets thrown out the window and they start over again. So they have a huge incentive to get it passed before the end of the year.
And what are you hearing as far as the sticking points yet? We've heard multiple times about the main one being the food stamp program, the SNAP program, that and other things yet?
Yes, there's still several issues that, are compromises that things need to be worked out. Some of the differences between them are things like the conservation title. We're looking at CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and whether or not we're going to roll that in with EQIP, what we're going to do to CRP acres, if we're going to bump those acres up or leave them where they're at. So there's some work to be done there. There's also some questions, I'd call them sort of technical issues that are being dealt with on things like ARC and PLC and the data sources for those. They're trying to fix some issues that came with cross-county inconsistencies in payments. So they're going to try to deal with that through using maybe some different data. So they still have to reconcile how they're going to do that.
On that commodity title and the ARC and PLC choice, and producers will have a chance to re-up in the program and once more make a selection between the two options. And you say that as it's looking now, PLC may look more appealing than when it was first introduced in the 2014 Farm Bill.
Right. So you remember when we were signing up for the 2014 Farm Bill, it was in the winter of 2015, and commodity prices were still relatively strong. So at that time, we had a majority of wheat base acres going into the ARC program, which was the county revenue program, and relatively fewer acres going into PLC. Well, there's been better payouts under PLC because of where commodity prices have gone. And so now we're standing from this perspective, it looks like you could get better payouts under PLC for several commodities, maybe relative to ARC. The trick to all of this, though, is what's going on today and what could be happening over the course of the next 5 years could be two completely different things, which is what we found out in the last 5-year cycle of the Farm Bill. So it's going to be tricky to help people figure out what their best options are, but we'll do the best we can to just try to help them think through what those options are and what decisions they need to make.
And as it's known to the moment, producers will be once again committing for multiple years under one or the other of the options. Is that still in play?
As I understand, that's how that'll work. It's still going to be another 4 to 5 year sign up, depending on exactly how they write it. But yeah, I think that option probably makes the most sense, especially if you don't want to have people going to FSA every single year doing signups and changing their mind about which program they want to be in. So it probably, from an administrative standpoint, it's better to keep them in for one program for 5 years.
The other side of the program that you'll be addressing during your presentations at the Ag Lenders Conferences, land values in Kansas, and once more associated with that, rental rates, as those track very closely together. We've spoken about this before, and your analysis of land values, we do have a fairly definite pullback on those values from their peaks a few years ago.
Yes, since 2015 to 2017, we saw about a 20% drop in land values statewide in Kansas, which, to be honest, given the profitability in the sector, was not unexpected. But in the last year and a half, things have stabilized, and we've really seen just a resiliency in land values that, well, it's sort of a shining star in everything else that's going on in the farm sector as far as balance sheets and cash flow and just general profitability in the sector.
And what has been at the root of that stabilization?
A couple of things, but one of the ones that's probably had the most impact is just a decrease in the supply of land that's been for sale. We just haven't seen as many sales of farmland over the last year as we would normally expect to see, and so that pullback in supply has been supporting prices.
And behind that, the willingness or unwillingness of producers, depending on their financial situation, to invest in farmland?
Well, it depends on what you're looking at. If you're talking about pretty high quality ground, bottom ground, something that you can, comparatively speaking is pretty high quality, then that ground will bring a pretty good price. On the other hand, if we're talking about relatively poor ground, people are being very picky about what they choose to spend their money on, and we've seen a much bigger price decline in the low quality ground in local markets.
And you'll be talking about whether or not we will see any movement off of square one here as far as that stability.
Right. I would just do a quick update on what we know about land values from the last 6 months, talk about where we think they might be headed. Lenders are going to be keenly interested in knowing where those land values are headed because it's an important aspect of collateral for loans. So I think it'll be an interesting topic for the group.
And a teaser as to what that direction might be?
I'm not optimistic. I think that given where commodity prices are, given the uncertainty in the trade situation, I just find it hard to believe that land values are going to be able to hold on forever, that they're going to have to make some kind of a downward adjustment to reflect what's going on in the market. And the question, though, becomes, well, how much and how quickly? And I think that has a lot to do with whether or not, in your local market, you see quite a few farms that put some land up for sale in order to restructure their loans and pay down debt. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be an interesting thing to track is what's going on in those local markets.
And one would assume then that rental rates will follow somewhat in lockstep with whatever happens.
Well, you would assume that, but that's not necessarily the case. Rental rates have only backed off a little bit, and as such, landowners are still looking for a reasonable rate of return, and given that land values haven't fallen, that rate of return is in some cases higher than what the profitability suggests they should be getting based on commodity prices and cost of production. So there's going to be some adjustments being made. And we've been talking about this for the last 2 years, which is just being very aware for producers of what your profitability is on every parcel that you farm and knowing your cost of production, because if you're paying too much for a piece of ground, you're going to have to decide at what point you can't afford to keep doing that. Mm-hmm. And that's a tough decision to make. But that's what we've been encouraging them to do, is just be very aware of their cost of production so that they can make those decisions wisely.
You'll be conversing about those matters with the Ag Lenders Conference attendees coming up. And once more, the session in Garden City is full up, and they're taking no more reservations for that one on October the 9th, which is next Tuesday. But the session here in Manhattan, Wednesday the 10th, the following day, at the K-State Alumni Center, still room for those who would participate.
Yes, the Manhattan meeting is still open, but we encourage you to get your registrations in as soon as possible, because we don't want to run out of room and have to turn you away from the Manhattan meeting as well.
And you can take care of all of that and read the entire agenda for the Ag Lenders Conferences online at agmanager.info, the full registration procedure there likewise. Good luck with the presentations there, Mykel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I would encourage everybody to look into this conference. You don't have to be an ag lender to participate. It is open to anyone in agribusiness or in production ag.
Excellent. Mykel Taylor with us. She's an agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. She will be presenting again on the 2018 Farm Bill and on Kansas land values and rental rates at the Ag Lenders Conferences, Garden City and Manhattan next week, put on by K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Now some input for you livestock producers who have put up forage this past growing season, and the merits of sampling that forage for nutrient content and otherwise is what we'll get into now. Joining us via phone from her office in Colby, northwest Kansas, is Jeanne Falk Jones. She's a multi-county agronomist in the northwest part of the state for K-State Research and Extension. Jeanne, this might be one of those years where forage sampling takes on added value, given, at least in several parts of Kansas, the droughty conditions that have occurred.
I think that's exactly right. And you look clear across the state, and we have, the drought in the eastern part of the state, and further out west, we've got a lot of hail damage on some crops. And so across the state, we might be feeding something that's a little bit different than what we typically do, whether it's a different feed stuff or we've had it grown in different growing conditions. And so it might be a good idea just to kind of take a look so you know what you've got. And this is important for the farmers who have been growing this forage and who are trying to do everything to make a good quality forage to help them understand a little bit what's going on and help them market it, and for the guys who are feeding this forage. So it's important on both sides of this.
Does this include not only the annual planted forages, but our perennial forages, alfalfas, even native hay?
I think so, yes. I think it's a good idea. In some cases I have guys who are calling and who are asking for the feed value of their product and things along those lines. The other ones that are calling are concerned about some toxicity on things, and that might be on nitrates. That would be for some of these forages that were stressed. And so, yes, I think it's the annual forages, it's the perennial forages. It's a really good way and a pretty reasonably priced way to know what you're putting into your cattle.
Well, since you talked of nitrate content, let's spend a moment here just listing what we're testing for specifically in a sampling.
So, is along the lines with the nitrates. It's folks who are concerned that they may have some forage that has some high levels of nitrates. And so we collect those samples just the same way as we do if we're collecting things for feed value, if you're going to get protein content or TDN or things along those lines. And so sampling is no different between those two things. So you can pull one sample and get a whole broad spectrum of information back.
Well, let's talk technique and tools of the trade for a moment here, if we might. Sampling probes, their capabilities, are there a number of options there?
There are actually a number of options. I'm pretty partial to one. It has a long snout for actually collecting the sample, but then it actually has a collector kind of at the back of it. And I like to use them with a power drill. You do have the ones that you can crank by hand. It's not near as easy, quick, or fun to collect samples when you're doing it by hand. So I try to have a good cordless drill with me, and make sure you bring your extra battery with you because you're probably going to need it. Make sure both batteries are fully charged, and so that's the hay sampler that I go out and collect samples with.
And what you're looking for is you decide what probe to use is something that will give you a decent core to work with then.
That's exactly right. You also want to make sure when you're getting your sampler, and you can check a lot of these out from your county extension offices, that it has a really nice sharp tip on it, because that's going to make really clean cuts as you're collecting those core samples.
Well, pulling those samples, those procedures, first off, where in the bale does one want to probe?
So when you stop and think about a bale, you have, I'm visualizing a round bale. You have your flat side to it, and then you have the rounded sides. What you're really going to want to do is go to that rounded side where you either have twine or net wrap, and you really kind of pull that net wrap apart, and what you're doing is angling towards the center of the bale. What we're trying to do is to get through as much of that bale as you can, coming in from the side to collect a core. And we usually talk about going in about 18 inches to collect a core from a specific bale, and that is really, you're going to encounter like 75% of the hay is really in that outer 18 inches of the bale. So we're just really trying to get a good cross-section of what is contained within that bale.
If just by chance you have large square bales, same procedure, basically any of the sides?
You would go in from the end that's kind of rounded, where you can go through as many flakes of that bale as you can. Mm-hmm. So don't go on the side where you can see the ends of the hay. You really want to go through as much of that as you can.
So how many samples does one take? Every bale is not practical, clearly, but what would one go by there?
Okay, so what we really want you to stop and think about is sampling in a lot. And so a lot may be from one field of your hay supply. And so if you think about, you have one field, you have those bales either sitting in the field or all kind of stacked together. And so what we're going to ask you to do is to take about 20 cores per lot of hay. And what this really is that we want enough cores that we're going to take variability out of that sample, and that we're going to get just a good quality sample out of that. So roughly 20 cores per lot of hay. And so when you're collecting those samples, just really think in your mind, is this lot going to be different than this other lot? And for sure, if you have clover hay and you have alfalfa hay and you have sorghum Sudan, those should all be sampled separately, but then there may be some division within that. But 20 cores per sample is a really good representative sample to have.
And then you composite the cores from that lot sampling for a representative idea?
That's exactly right. And so along with bringing your bale core and extra batteries, make sure you bring a good clean bucket with you to the field so you can be collecting that sample and compositing that together. And then you want roughly a half of a gallon baggie full of forage to send in so that we have enough to have a good sample for them to be testing with on the other end.
Does that have to be an airtight seal on that bag then?
I usually put them in a baggie, kind of squish the air out, seal it up, make sure you label that baggie so that you know exactly where that came from, and don't just number your hay piles in case somebody else would look at them and think they're numbered a little differently. Label it so that it makes sense to you, so that when you get results back, you'll know what sample it came out of and makes sense to others who might also be looking at those samples.
And you touched upon this a moment ago, but then producers can take those samples to their local extension office, which can then traffic those samples to the K-State Forage Lab for testing or otherwise, right?
That's exactly right. Yes, bring them into your extension office. They'll have a little bit of paperwork for you to fill out. That will be based on what kind of testing that you want to have done. And then, and then they can just send them in from your extension office to K-State or other local labs around to get some good results back for you. And turnaround time is really pretty quick on these samples. And so you'll know within a week or maybe a little bit more of what you have out there in that forage.
Now, producers, Jeanne, are always watching expenses, and this does have a fee attached to it, running a sample, but the payoff certainly can be there.
I think, yes, I really do. I think it's valuable to know what you're feeding to your cattle. And so when you're thinking about putting a ration together and you have different qualities of forage, you know how to put that ration together. And so how do you make that step unless you actually know what you've got in your feed? And so I think it's a very reasonable way to get some good results back and know what you're feeding. Yeah. I think it'll pay dividends down the road. And
especially this year, given the potential variability in the quality of that forage, it's well worthwhile.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think that's I think it's important every year, but maybe more so this year because we have such different growing conditions that we've been dealing with all summer long.
Well, producers, if you need a probe for sampling your forage, you can, again, check with your local extension office. That's also the venue to drop off those samples for delivery to a lab for full analysis, and that local extension agricultural agent can answer any questions further about forage sampling here in the fall in advance of cattle feeding later this fall and winter. And we appreciate the word, Jeanne, as always. Many thanks.
You're very welcome.
She's Jeanne Falk Jones. Jeanne is a multi-county agronomist for K-State Research and Extension based in northwest Kansas. And briefly here, while we're talking about forage quality nutritional evaluation, a few years back, the K-State Research and Extension Forage Task Force conducted a statewide demonstration project, cooperating with local extension agricultural agents evaluating the nutritional value of crop residues. And there is a write-up on that work available through the K-State Research and Extension online bookstore. It gets into the nutritive value of corn and grain sorghum residue, looking at the total dry matter per acre, crude protein content, TDN content as well. And it also features some thoughts on how crop residues fit into a total grazing program, as this initiative encouraged producers to take full advantage of that forage resource that crop residues provide post-harvest. Again, by title, look for Nutritional Evaluation of Grazed Kansas Corn and Sorghum Crop Residues at ksre.ksu.edu/bookstore. We'll stand aside now for a few moments here on Agriculture Today. When we return, today's lead stories in agricultural news and the Kansas soybean update for this week. Greg Akagi waiting in the wings with that. And our weekly horticulture segment is still ahead, taking on a handful of late-season vegetable gardening items with K-State's Ward Upham. So stay with us, won't you, here on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now today's agricultural news headlines in brief, courtesy in part of DTN. Yesterday, a group of leading dairy exporters praised the potential increased market access to Canada, but called on the Trump administration to drop the steel and aluminum tariffs that have hurt dairy exports into Mexico, the top export market for products such as cheese. The leaders from the International Dairy Foods Association are in Washington to talk to lawmakers about trade, including the new United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and the importance of getting the Trump administration to drop the Section 232 tariffs against Mexico. With the overall dairy industry exporting 15% of total production, getting more market access to Canada, and dropping that Class 7 dairy pricing system in Canada are both going to provide more potential access to the Canadian market. That, according to the CEO of the Dairy Foods Association, Mykel Taylor. Dykes added, though, that Mexico is the top destination for dairy exports, taking up roughly 25% of all U.S. dairy exports. Exports to Mexico have reduced dramatically since the U.S. placed tariffs on aluminum and steel from several countries, including Mexico, which responded with a 25% tariff on dairy products. Those tariffs have placed the U.S. at a disadvantage, says Dykes. Now, the deal does boost U.S. market access into Canada's domestic product by almost 4%, with some specific tonnage quotas for various products. Beyond those Mexican tariffs, dairy exporters say another issue they face is the limitations on cheese names that Mexico has now in place because of the trade agreement with the European Union. The new USMCA deal includes a side letter allowing common names for most cheeses, but does not include popular cheeses such as Asiago or Parmesan. These European Union geographical indicators risk shutting U.S. exporters out of the dairy markets that they created. Biotechnology and addressing issues such as sanitary and phytosanitary trade barriers were key areas of agreement in this new trade deal between the three North American nations. More on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
One of the key agricultural-based achievements in recent trade agreements between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, according to the chief agricultural negotiator for the U.S. Trade Representative's office,
is a discussion about standards for biotechnology and consultations about new types of biotechnology like gene editing.
Ambassador Greg Dowd says agreement was also reached on ways to reduce trade-distorting policies among the three nations, including increased transparency on export restrictions that have a basis in food security. Also addressed,
how do we enhance dealing with sanitary and phytosanitary issues at the speed of commerce?
With advancement of science-based decision-making and improved certification processes. The ambassador says with the USMCA trade deal and specific areas of agreement like biotech and reducing trade-distorting policies,
we have a lot of agreement in North America on how to deal with these issues, and this is a way that we can demonstrate to the world this is how we'd like to proceed with other countries going forward.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, control of Congress could be the key when Congress votes on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, according to two Republican lawmakers. If the Democrats take the House, the vote will be in the lame duck session, according to Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, referring to the roughly 2-month period between the election and the new Congress starting in January. Grassley went on to say if the Republicans keep the House, it will be next year. He says that given the Senate calendar and the need to finish appropriations are in place, it would be better to vote next year. Grassley is the current chair of the Judiciary Committee, as you know. He may become Senate Finance Chairman next year following the retirement of current chair or Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah. Grassley's new post assumes that Republicans would keep control of that chamber. He does expect the trade deal to pass. Grassley also said that China needs to take note common sense tells me, in his words. Congress has the simple majority of votes needed to pass the new USMCA, Grassley said. That is very positive for the U.S. agricultural industry. He added that Beijing should take note, in his words, saying that the pact shows that the president can rebalance trade deals, saying that 95% of what we'll be voting on is the same as in NAFTA. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and next up for you this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And standing by, as always, with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Kellen Leach, economist with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, joins us. And Kellen, KDA remains involved with the commodity commissions through several avenues. And one of them is helping with the process of election of board members to the commodity commissions. How does that work for KDA?
The process that we go through, every year there are actually 9 districts in the state of Kansas for grain commodity commission elections. And this year we are electing commissioners for districts 7, 8, and 9, the eastern third of the state. So right now we are canvassing for commissioners for that eastern third of the state for them to get signatures on their petitions to show interest to fill those spots on those boards to be commissioners for the 5 grain commodity commissions.
So if there's someone who is interested in doing that, there are some deadlines that are coming up here before the end of the year.
The petitions for candidacy have to be postmarked by November 30th. And those petitions, they have to receive 20 signatures of growers that are actually growing the commodity, in this instance, soybeans. They have to obtain those 20 signatures and then have those petitions postmarked by November 30th.
Now, in the case of if you are not interested in becoming a commissioner but would like to vote, you also need to register to vote?
You do. You can register to vote by December 31st, either by signing someone's petition, or you can go to the KDA website, agriculture.ks.gov, and you can actually fill out the form there to register to vote, or you can contact the Kansas Soybean Commission as well to register to vote. All 5 of the Kansas Grain Commodity Commissions, the Kansas Department of Agriculture, we do the administrative function for those elections. The Kansas Soybean Commission is no different in that aspect.
And they also encourage candidates who reflect diverse enterprise sizes, experiences, methods of production and distribution, marketing strategies, and other distinguishing factors to ensure its commissioners reflect the diversity of those its programs serve. If they'd like more information about all this, can they go to your website, Kellen?
The Kansas Department of Agriculture website can be found at agriculture.ks.gov, and you can go to the Grain Commodity Commission site of the website there. You can not only get the petitions for candidacy, as well as register to vote there.
That is Kellen Leach, who is economist with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And remember to listen to our broadcast anytime you choose. Visit agtoday.net, and you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe to that. agtoday.net. This is the K-State Radio Network. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. This Agriculture Today comes to a close with another horticultural subject for you. Across the way once again is K-State Research and Extension horticulturist Ward Upham. And Ward, yes, the vegetable gardening season is starting to wind down now as we are officially into fall. Still a chance to reap the rewards of tomato plantings out there. And in fact, there's been a pretty nice flush of growth on tomato plants here in the latter month or so.
There certainly has. Now, we went through a dry spell caused by the heat that we had this summer. Whenever you get very, very hot, those tomatoes just stop producing. And then when it starts to get cool, they'll start to set again. And those tomatoes that set after we start to get cool are now ripening. And so for those people that have lots of foliage left on their plants, they probably have lots of tomatoes too. Now, if you had some foliage diseases that wiped out the foliage, you're not going to have that. Right. But for a lot of people, they've got a really good crop of tomatoes at this time of year.
And the quality of tomatoes as they ripen right around now, equal to that of those that ripen in mid to late summer?
It can be. It's just that we have one disease that tends to show up every fall. It's called anthracnose. And it's a disease that causes a little sunken spot on the fruit, and then it causes the fruit to go ahead and rot. And so watch for those and discard any where you see that, because you're not going to be able to save those. But the rest of them that avoid that disease should be good quality.
Now, you say, though, that the size of these late tomatoes may not be as ample as it would be for those that ripen earlier in the season.
That's right. We've got a lot of foliage, and we've got tomatoes that have set in large numbers, and whenever you have a large number of tomatoes, often that size suffers. So even though they're smaller, they still can be good quality, so it's good to have tomatoes late in the season.
Well, what we want to offer today is a few guidelines on picking tomatoes, when to get it done, and how to store those tomatoes. For one thing, you pick those ahead of the first frost.
Yeah, so up to then, you can just pick them whenever they're fully ripe, or at least at the breaker stage. Breaker stage is that stage when they've started to turn color. And from that point on, you're not going to gain any quality by leaving them on the vine. You can go ahead and pick them and bring them inside and let them ripen inside. But if there's a frost that's threatening, it's a good idea to get those fruit off the plant. And what we recommend is you divide them into 3 groups when you pick them. And so the first group is going to be those that are ripe or nearly ripe. And then the second group are those that are in the process of ripening. And the third group are those that are still green, but if you look on the underside of that fruit, you can see a very faint white star. And those are mature enough that they'll go ahead and ripen. They may not be as good a quality as those that have already started to turn, but you can have some late tomatoes then that are better than usually what you can get in a grocery store.
And storing these late harvested tomatoes then, any suggestions there?
Yeah, a good idea to put those in a single layer on newspaper. Just in case one of those rots, it doesn't just pass from one tomato to another. And therefore, you can watch those every day or two and discard any that are rotting, and then you can use them as they ripen.
All right. And temperature for storage, is there a recommendation there?
Yeah, as close to 55 degrees as you can get. Now, a lot of people won't be able to get that low. That's not a big deal. It's just that will slow that ripening process again, so you can have tomatoes as late as possible.
This has been a terrific year for pepper production in most vegetable gardens around Kansas, you tell us. Things fell into place just right, what?
They certainly have. And peppers are less sensitive to that heat that we talked about with tomatoes. And so they'll bear over a longer period of time than tomatoes ever will. And this year, everything has fallen into place so that a lot of our pepper plants are just loaded at this time of year. And so what people want to do is how, again, do I pick these if a frost threatens? Well, peppers are really sensitive to frost. So again, make sure you get out there and pick those before we get that frosty night. And then just remember that peppers will last a long time if they're kept in a crisper. They'll usually keep for several weeks. And so figure out about how many you're going to need for that, let's say 3-week period, and then just put those in a crisper and use them as needed. However, you're probably going to have more than that. And so what you can do in order to preserve them is freeze them. And the way you do that is you dice them and then put them on a cookie sheet and freeze them that way. If you dice them and put them in a bag and freeze them, they're going to end up as one big lump. And they're going to be very difficult to use unless you use the whole package at one time. And so by freezing them on a cookie sheet, they'll stay separated. You can pour out what you need and then go ahead and keep the others frozen that you have left over.
And we wanted to finish on one more opportunity, and this is about garden planting, surprisingly enough, here in this part of the season. Garlic should go in right around now, you say?
Yes, garlic has to be planted in the fall. You do not plant this in the spring. And so early October is ideal. Anytime from late September through early November is going to be fine. And so make sure you get that in the next month or so that you can have garlic for next year.
And what are the basic guidelines for establishing garlic plantings?
So first thing, of course, is fertilization. You can use about 3 pounds of a 10-10-10 fertilizer per 100 square feet, or fertilize according to soil test, and then put that on the surface of the ground and till it in. You want to make sure that you have your fertilizer down before you till, because you want that phosphorus and potassium mixed into the soil. Those nutrients do not move. Mm-hmm. Nitrogen does, but phosphorus and potassium do not. And so you want them in that soil where the roots can take advantage of it as soon as those cloves start to grow.
And then as far as putting the cloves in the ground, depth, spacing, those basics, what does one need to do there?
Yeah, so you're going to have a bulb. So you're going to take those individual cloves off the bulb and plant those maybe 1 to 2 inches deep and about 6 inches apart. So pretty simple. And then water in well and mulch so that you kind of capture the heat that soil still has. That way it'll become well established before it gets extremely cold. Mm-hmm. And then you may want to mark where that garlic is, because it is easy to forget that and then till up that area again the next spring. So just make sure you know where it's at, and then they'll do their own thing.
And if one succeeds in establishing the garlic, they can expect a harvest fairly early summer, you say?
Yeah, usually about early June is when you can start at least test digging the garlic. And so dig up a few plants, and then if they have segmented by that point, you're ready to go. If not, you wait another 1 or 2 weeks, and then you can dig again. And once they're segmented, you can go ahead and harvest the whole bunch.
Again, you've a fairly wide window of opportunity for planting garlic, but this is the ideal time, this first part of October, to establish such a planting in your garden. Ward, we always appreciate the input. Thanks for coming over.
You bet.
K-State horticulturist Ward Upham with us on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. That'll do it for our Thursday edition. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.